Representatives Haraz, Ghanbari, and Cindy Abrams, welcome back to Messenger in the House.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
We are here to talk about a very important bill that was actually just signed into law, Sub-House Bill 479. The bill creates the Ohio Post-Traumatic Stress Fund Commission, and I will start with that. What is that piece of the bill all about?
So just to clarify, the language that we're talking about today was amended into an existing bill.
Yes.
And the amendment that Cindy and I worked on with Tom Patton and our friends at the Fraternal Order of the Police and the Ohio Association of Professional Firefighters and members of House leadership. What this amendment does is it creates the Post-Traumatic Stress Injury Fund. Cindy and I, since we've come to the House back in 2019, have been working quite closely with our partners on standing up a mechanism to make sure that our first responders with the what is often referred to as the invisible wounds of service, mental health issues, post-traumatic stress injuries and disorders, they have a mechanism now in place where they can get the help that they need. This is a reimbursement model. We put $40 million into a fund. This amendment allows that fund money to be dispersed by standing up the Post-Traumatic Stress Injury Commission. They're going to be creating rules. They're going to have some checks and balances in there to make sure that the funds are going where they need to go. First responders can apply for up to $50,000. And if it exceeds that, there's a mechanism in place where they can go back and apply for some additional funds.
Rep. Abrams, why was this meaningful for you to champion? I know this was a process to get finished, so kind of talk through, the highlights and why you're proud of the bill.
Well, our first responders, they respond to, quite often when you dial 911, it's literally the worst moment of your life. People generally don't call 911 when they're having a great day, generally. Some do, but that's a whole other story. So it's your worst day of your life, the worst moment of your life, and our first responders respond no matter what. And they show up, and there are some pretty traumatic and horrific crime scenes, whether it's homicide, whether it's child abuse, neglect. There are things that you're never going to unsee, and there are things that you're never going to forget your whole entire life. Also, really kind of going further than that, line of duty death, when you're standing at the casket, paying your respects to the officer in the casket, and they're wearing the same uniform as you, that will forever change you. And so it's very important to get our first responders the help that they need when they need it most, and it's just to return them back to their families and to the community they serve healthy. That's the point of this.
Yes, thank you for breaking that down. I want to ask what types of treatment and expenses are going to be eligible for reimbursement under this, just so folks know about the resources.
I want to just kind of echo something that my good friend Cindy had said. When I was working on this and having conversations with House leadership, I actually got a text message from a good friend of mine, his wife, and she had messaged me asking if I could call and check in on her husband. And I asked her what was going on, and he had been dispatched out to a fatal car crash just the shift before. He was the first officer on the scene, actually crawled into this mangled car on the interstates and did everything he could to save the life of the driver. The driver was a mom. In the vehicle was her husband and their daughter. And my friend's wife said, the mom passed away as a result of the crash, but I think what stuck with her husband more was seeing that young girl in that car and that young girl seeing her mom in the condition. And so, a lot of our first responders, many of them have families, they have spouses, they have kids, neighbor kids, grandma, grandpa, mom and dad. It's sometimes very challenging to see the things that they see. At the end of their shift, go home and just turn it off. And so I reached out to him and had a long conversation with him about, how he was doing. But, these are some of the things that, stick with our first responders. And the thing that I think is important for our viewers to understand is these type of injuries don't just happen in our big communities like a Cleveland or a Toledo or a Cincinnati or, a Columbus. These type of incidents are happening all across the state of Ohio. And it may be, your first time on a shift out of the academy, or it may be the end of a 3 or 4 decade career, and then everything that happens in between. Now, certainly our bigger communities have higher run volumes, and so there is the potential for these type of incidents and calls to happen with more frequency, but it also compounds the challenges that our first responders are facing when they're trying to process what they've seen, how they reacted. Could I have done something differently? Would the outcome have been different? And as they're still processing those things, guess what? The alarm drops. So just as if one of our first responders were to have a broken arm or a broken leg, they're going to have the necessary time to recuperate so that when a call comes in, they can respond and they can be fully prepared. It's no different with an invisible wound of mental health. It's an injury that needs to have time to heal and to be strengthened. And, sometimes you break an arm or, your leg, you're going through some type of rehabilitation. Well, for those type of mental injuries, they're still going through a type of rehabilitation, if you will. It may not be, lifting weights or doing something along those lines, but, this is something that will certainly save lives. And I don't think Cindy or I could sit here and tell you that if this was in place last year, this outcome would have been different. But what I think we could confidently say is now that this is in place, it will give that first responder another tool in their toolbox. It will give them every fighting chance to succeed and get back out into our communities.
And to Haraz's point, the help is there and it's available. And this reimbursement model, let's say if cost is a factor of whether it be counseling or whatever other treatment that's approved by the board and rules, if cost were a factor, this takes that away, quite frankly. After insurance pays what they pay, your out-of-pocket costs, your deductible, all that's paid, but then the extra money would be reimbursed. And let's not forget that, civilians in society literally see maybe 1 or 2 traumatic incidents in their whole entire lives. Our first responders see hundreds, especially over a 30-year career.
And I want to ask, do you both think that having the extra funding and treating it, like you would a physical injury, do you think these resources are going to help combat the stigma of seeking out resources and asking for help?
We've done so much just in the time that we've been in the General Assembly since 2019. We stood up a peer support that you're allowed to have that confidentiality piece, and you stand up peer support teams within the department. Look, we trust our own, right? So a lot of times law enforcement won't go to a counselor because, quite frankly, why explain to the counselor, there's so much dynamic with law enforcement and the fire service that most people don't understand, right? So you can see a horrific scene and then, you're hungry. So it's like, well, let's go to dinner. Most people would probably be sick over that, but you see things daily that are just horrific and heartbreaking, but yet you're still hungry. And normal folks think that doesn't make sense or we're cold. That's not it at all. The brain has a way of protecting the body that, you just saw that, but we're going to unsee it for a minute and then just kind of try to hide it, push it down. And that's not healthy. And that's when they start drinking and, obviously suicide and whatnot, things that are self-medicating is never healthy. So.
Yeah, I agree with Cindy. It's okay to not be okay, but what's not okay is to not provide them the resources that they need to heal. As we have seen over, the last couple dozen years or so, especially, in the military, there was a time in which if you went to seek mental health counseling that was connected to your service, you had to disclose that on your security clearance background check. When I was a former news photographer, I covered the press conference at the Pentagon in which the Pentagon made the decision that so long as this was service connected, you no longer had to even acknowledge that on the background check. Why? Because they didn't want a stigma to be associated with someone saying, you know what, I do need some help. I need to talk to someone and process some of the things that I saw downrange in places like, Iraq or Afghanistan. So they removed that stigma. I think, that's no different than what our first responders are doing. They're wearing a uniform. Their mission set is different than our mission set in the military, but they're still serving their community. And that stigma has slowly started to kind of erode itself away a little bit, which is important because the last thing that we want is someone to say, I didn't feel comfortable asking for help. And when you think about it, everyone looks at our first responders and police officers and firefighters and paramedics and those that are out on the front line almost as, almost as if they all have capes on, as if, nothing will affect them. They're our superheroes, right? And I think that comes a little bit with some heavy weight on the shoulders because they know that their community is relying on it. They have to show up and be their best at all times. This is starting to tell these first responders, hey, it's okay to put the cape down for today. It's okay to go in and talk to a peer, as Cindy had mentioned with some of the peer support programs. This will be another step in removing that stigma associated with it.
I agree with that. The stigma is still there. We're not going to sugarcoat it. It is still there, but we are chipping away at it in the fact that, when I started 30 years ago with Cincinnati Police Department, you did not acknowledge that you're struggling with anything because then you were weak or, whatever. And so today, like I said, we're chipping away at that. And it's not, the stigma should not be there because look, it's not normal to see some of the things that our first responders see and go through. And then there's a human behind the badge and the body armor. There's an actual human there that's someone's husband or wife or girlfriend or boyfriend. And at the end of the day, someone's parent. And it's okay for them to struggle, but then to get the help they need to return back healthy. That is the goal of what we've been working on up here for the last 7 years.
And I want to ask, in this process, what kind of feedback have you been getting back from these professionals?
Very positive. Finally, they're so relieved because they know it. And it's so hard to see your loved ones. It's certainly a brotherhood with the police and fire service. And it's so hard to see someone struggling. And to Haraz's point, you try to help them, listen, talk it out, be there for them. But at the same time, a little bit of professional help never hurts, in my very strong opinion.
Yeah.
One of the things that Cindy had mentioned is, that we collectively have been working on this for about 7 years, but, there were folks that came before us in organizations like the FOP and the OAPFF that have been working on it well before we got here. So, this was building upon some of the, successes that we've had in previous General Assemblies. It just happened to be now was the time that, we got it across the line. And I've heard from a lot of first responders, not just in my legislative district, but, across the state of Ohio that have said simply, thank you, from their spouses and their families. Thank you. What's key to know for our viewers is obviously the governor signed this today. It's going to take 90 days to go into effect. They're going to have to stand up the rules process. That's going to have roughly 90 days to stand the commission up and vet those rules. So there's still a little bit of time before those applications can be submitted. But I want these first responders to know, hey, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Help is on the way. It is coming. It will come. Going forward, we're going to continue to look at ways that we can continue to sustain the post-traumatic stress injury fund that collectively we as a legislature put that $40 million in. So this is something that doesn't end today with the bill signing. This is something that, we still have to be very cognizant of. And as these programs are rolled out, there's going to be some requirements in there where there's going to be some reports that are going to have to be extended back to the legislature. We want to make sure that the funds that are being expended are actually making the difference that they need to be making and that they're intended to make. And if there's something that, we need to adjust going forward, I would say Cindy and I and, hopefully our colleagues will be open to making those adjustments as the process rolls out.
Yes, I know you both will not stop fighting, so we appreciate it as citizens of Ohio, and thank you for coming on. Quickly, I want to talk about our social media. You can follow us on Ohio House GOP Caucus on Facebook, Ohio House _GOP on Instagram, and OHR GOP Caucus on Twitter. You can subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. State Representative Cindy Abrams and Haraz Ghanbari, thank you again.
Thank you for having us.